Collapsing empire. Rest in peace, CIA fronts overt operations. The National Endowment for Democracy, a supposedly non-governmental organization, is in reality an overt front for the CIA. It is a sign of US imperialist decline that the NED has felt the need to hide details of activities which it formerly published openly. The understanding that spreading democracy is imperialist doublespeak for overthrowing governments with sovereign ambitions has simply become too widespread for the CIA's overt operations front to continue in its old way. Reproduced from Global Delinquents, with thanks. In recent months, a remarkable development in US imperialism's decline has gone almost entirely unnoticed. The National Endowment for Democracy's NED grant database has been removed from the web. Until recently, a searchable interface allowed visitors to view detailed records of Washington-funded NGOs, civil society groups, and media projects in particular countries, covering most of the world, the sums involved and entities responsible for delivering these initiatives. This resource has now inexplicably vanished, and with it enormous amounts of incontrovertible, self-incriminating evidence of destructive US skullduggery abroad. Take, for example, NED grant records for Georgia, the site of recent repeated colour revolution efforts, at the forefront of which were endowment bankrolled organisations. While still accessible via Internet archives, they were deleted during the summer. Today, visitors to associated URLs are redirected to a brief entry simply titled Eurasia. The accompanying text describes in very broad terms the endowment's aims regionally and the total being spent, but the crucial questions of where and on what aren't clarified. In a comic hypocrisy, too, the blurb boldly states, "The heart of NED's work in the region is the need to maintain access to objective information for local populations. Across the region, government actors are attempting to limit the space for citizens to distribute information and communicate freely online. Resultantly, independent academics, activists, researchers and journalists have been deprived of an invaluable resource for tracking and exposing imperialist machinations. Yet the endowment incinerating its public paper trail can only be considered a significant victory for these same actors. NED's explicit and avowed raison d'etre was to do publicly what US intelligence did, and in many cases still does, covertly. Now, after 40 years of wreaking havoc worldwide via overt operations in service of empire, the CIA front has been forced underground, defeating its entire purpose. How long can it now survive? Spyless coups. The NED was founded in November 1983 after the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, became embroiled in a series of embarrassing public scandals. Then Agency Director William Casey was central to its construction. His objective was to create a public mechanism to conduct traditional CIA meddling overseas, except out in the open. Ever since, the endowment has financed countless opposition groups, activist movements, media outlets and trade unions to the tune of untold millions to engage in propaganda and political activism, to disrupt, destabilize, and displace enemy regimes the world over. The NED's true nature was openly acknowledged by mainstream media for many years. In June 1986, longtime endowment president Carl Gershman told the New York Times that it would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be subsidized by the CIA. Past exposure of such connivances meant that they had been discontinued and farmed out to the NED. Several high-ranking interviewees strenuously denied there was any connection between the NED and the agency, although the outlet acknowledged that many endowment programs seemed superficially similar to the past CIA operations. At this time, the NED was hard at work killing off communism in the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries, and Yugoslavia. This included, for instance, enormous investment in Poland's infamous Solidarity trade union, which became a global emblem of anti-communist resistance. In September of 1991, the Washington Post published a highly laudatory appraisal of these efforts, stating that the political miracles the endowment had achieved in the former Soviet sphere had ushered in a new world of spyless coups and innocence abroad. The old era of covert action is dead. The world doesn't run in secret anymore. We are now living in the age of overt action. When such activities are done overtly, the flap potential is close to zero. Openness is its own protection. Covert funding for these groups would have been the kiss of death if discovered. Overt funding, it would seem, has been a kiss of life. The NED proceeded to take down a number of governments throughout the 1990s and 2000s very overtly. In many cases, mainstream outlets published highly revealing accounts detailing precisely how. In Ukraine in November 2004, endowment-trained and bankrolled activists forced a rerun of that year's presidential election to install a pro-Western puppet. As The Guardian jubilantly reported, the entire effort was an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing, which had been repeatedly deployed in the new millennium to topple unsavory regimes. Funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the two big American parties and US non-government organizations, the operation engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. Kiss of death. The next year, USAID published a glossy magazine, Democracy Rising, bragging extensively about how it and the NED had been fundamental to a wave of insurrectory upheaval in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere during the first years of the 21st century. Fast forward to February 2014, and Ukraine's government once again fell victim to an endowment-orchestrated coup in the form of the Maidan Revolution. Yet the media either ignored the irrefutable US role in fomenting the upheaval or dismissed the proposition as Russian disinformation or conspiracy theory. This is despite contemporary polls never showing majority Ukrainian support for the Maidan protests. Ousted President Viktor Yanukovych, remaining the most popular politician in the country until his last day in office, every actor at Maidan's forefront, including the individuals who started the demonstrations, receiving NED or US aid funding, leaders of Washington-financed organizations in the country openly advertising their desire to overthrow Yanukovych in the years before, and the endowment pumping around $20 million into the country in 2013 alone. A Maidan crowd? This mass omerta, which has intensified since, may be attributable to ever-rising hostility towards the NED by foreign governments and populations, and associated efforts to restrict or outright proscribe the organization. The reality of the endowment's raison d'etre and modus operandi has thus not only become unsayable, but must be vehemently denied by Western journalists. Representatively, a July 2015 Guardian report on Russia banning the NED quite unbelievably relied on a brief quote from the endowment's own website to describe its operations. While the mainstream media may have remained silent on the NED's mephitic influence overseas over the past decade, the same is not true of dissent academics, activists, researchers and journalists. The endowment grant database served as an invaluable tool for keeping a close eye on Washington's international intrigues and mapping the personal and organizational connections of NED-sponsored agents and entities of influence. Meanwhile, the endowment's status as a CIA front could be simply proven via multiple public admissions of its own leaders. Whenever protests erupted somewhere in the world and received widespread Western news coverage, concerned citizens could consult the NED grant database and find in the overwhelming majority of cases that most, if not all, individuals and groups quoted in associated media reports were in receipt of endowment funding. While difficult to quantify, it would be unsurprising if dissident voices calling attention to this fact has helped to avert colour revolution efforts, disrupted meddling campaigns, protected popular governments and political figures, and more. Of course, despite the NED brazenly purging evidence of its vast operations from the web, its conniving continues apace regardless, now covertly. One might even argue that the endowment's chicanery is all the more dangerous as a result, given that individuals and organizations can conceal their funding sources. But the move amply shows that the NED today cannot withstand the slightest public scrutiny which its existence was intended to exemplify. It also demonstrates that overt operations with open US funding are now the very kiss of death the endowment was meant to replace. The empire is on the run.